Hello, everyone, from wherever you've joined us at this panel discussion for Africa Industrialisation Week, hosted by the International Growth Centre at the London School of Economics. I'm David Luke of the Fiyoslaji Institute for Africa here at the LSE. I'll be moderating today's panel. Before we get started, let's give you a few housekeeping items. Firstly, all attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. If you have a question during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box, which you can access at the bottom of your screen. We're going to have a designated time at the end of the panel discussion to answer questions. So please type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. Please make sure to include your full name and organizational affiliation. I should also say we are recording today's session, and a video and audio recording will be made available on the IGC's and the Fiyoslaji Institute for Africa websites. I'd also like to point out that there will be a brief survey immediately following today's panel discussion. So please take a minute to fill that out later, as your feedback is very important to us. Please feel free to contribute to the conversation online by using the hashtag Africa Industrialisation. Today, this panel has been organized to mark the Africa Industrialisation Week, which was established by the United Nations in 1989 to raise awareness about the importance of industrialization for the economic development of Africa. Industrialization of Africa means enhanced productivity, skilled workforce, employment generation, technological advancement, and innovation. As the African Continental Free Trade Area takes off and countries adjust to the new trade regimes, industrialization strategies need to be revisited to incorporate the continental market access offered by the AfCFTA. Industrialization with strong linkages between the economies of the continent will help African countries reduce poverty, diversify their economies, and reduce their vulnerability to external shocks, as economic modeling by the Economic Commission for Africa, the World Bank, and others have demonstrated. This panel discussion aims to delve into the issues, in particular how the AfCFTA will influence industrialization strategies and contributes to poverty reduction and environmentally sound industrial development. As panel speakers, we are very fortunate to have with us today Professor Olawale Ogunkola of the Department of Economics, University of Ibadan, Nigeria, who is on sabbatical leave at the Fiyoslaji Institute for Africa here at the LSE. We also have Madam Fatima Asil, Vice President of the Central African Economic and Monetary Community, and she was previously the Commissioner for Trade and Industry at the African Union Commission. We're also joined by Dr. Stephen Karinge, Director of the Trade and Regional Integration Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Regretfully, the Honorable Minister of Trade and Industry of Uganda, Madam Harriet Inzabazi, could not join us at the last minute due to an unexpected change to her schedule. But as you can see, we have a very experienced and knowledgeable panel who would be discussing these issues. I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to each of our speakers before we move on to general discussion and offer you, the audience, a chance to ask your own questions. For the first round, I'll begin with Professor Ogunkola. Professor Ogunkola, as you know, various attempts at industrialization over the years have yielded limited results as Africa's manufacturing value added remains very low. Exports of African countries remain dominated by commodities with little processing. African countries' participation in the global value chains remain at the lower ranks. There is need to address constraints to industrial development, including inadequate infrastructure, technological challenges, investment, etc. And in an effort to address these challenges, special economic zones have emerged as a strategy for boosting industrialization on the continent. In 2021, 203 zones were in operation in 44 out of the 54 African countries. So, Professor Ngukola, what can we learn from the experience of special economic zones in Africa as a strategy for boosting industrial production?
Thank you very much, David. That's a good one to start with. I think you are right. By all the indicators of industrialization, we are still very, very low as Africans. And various efforts in terms of establishing special economic zone, different types of policies are yet to be effective. We've practiced import substitution industrialization strategies. We moved to export strategies, yet we are yet to take off in terms of increasing manufacturing value addition. Not only for our benefit, also to address some of the basic things that we think will help us in terms of development. Take the issue of food security. We are still net importer of processed foods. Take the issue of employment. We have unemployment at an alarming rate. It appears that the strategies are not the issue. Rather, I think it has to do with the development and implementation of some of these strategies. You've pointed out the issue of special economic zone. My take on this is the design and even the practice of special economic zones in Africa generally are pigeonholed in terms of what we want from the special economic zones. Just like you mentioned, the issue of getting foreign direct investment, the issue of increasing export, the issue of increasing employment. Even if we take all the three, not all the special economic zones were able to attract foreign direct investment. We know some zones that you have only one or two firms operating in the whole zone. Why is this? Assuming that we even have export processing zone that was able to generate employment, to increase export of the host country, and to bring in foreign direct investment. I see all these elements as static benefits from export processing zone. And they will do little in terms of what we want export processing zone to do in terms of driving industrialization. Let me explain. For some countries, export processing zone is like what we normally see on the street, military zones, keep off. So they are so disconnected from the domestic economy. In terms of input, if we are to look at it, not all of them actually depend on national input, rather they import the input they use in production. So how do we ensure that they relate to the economy in terms of sourcing, even if it is not the original substitute that is available locally, to be able to promote this type of connection that I want between firms operating in the zone and the domestic economy? Is quite very, very important. If we are able to achieve that type of link, especially given the number of small, medium enterprises that we have, that will then lead to multiplier effect in the host economy. It will generate more ripple effect and it will be able to lift up millions of people. When you look at the employment offer in the zones, they are usually unskilled one. We need to move to the next level of having skilled employment, training people to be able to take advantage and take charge of some of the production processes. If we do this, we will develop their capacity and capabilities, and some of them will be able to use such skills, not only in the zone, even outside the zone, and to benefit the economy in general. So apart from making sure we have connection in terms of input use, in terms of skilled workers, which we transfer technology, because that's the conduit. If you have people that are knowledgeable at a reasonable level of operation, whatever they learn from the zones can easily be translated to the real economy. But there is need for the host government to invest and to ensure that firms in the special economic zones are not operating in isolation of the domestic economy. There is need for investment, because when you talk about workers, who is going to bear the cost of training and retraining? Who is going to ensure that proper skills are actually imbibed? Who is going to ensure that the right type of quality in terms of input or output are actually developed? I think those are the areas which I regard as public goods, and which there is need for public investment to take care of. So to me, we should not develop zones as enclaves of host economy. We should emphasize the linkages, the dynamic linkages, in order for us to be able to have the right spillover to the host economy. I think I will stop here now, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ogokolo. I think you've put us on a very sobering note to get our discussion started by emphasizing that yes, special economic zones, industrial development zones can play an important role in the industrialization process, but care should be taken that the linkages to the real economy are there, that the public goods that to support these zones are also there. I think you emphasized training, technology, standards, quality, among the key issues that need to be addressed simultaneously. So I think these are very sobering thoughts to get us started. So let me move on then to Madam Asil. Madam Asil, you were African Union Commissioner for Trade and Industry when the AfCFTA deal was signed. There is a large body of evidence to suggest progressive closing of the gender wage gap, with women's wages increasing as industrial development takes off, not only in sectors like textile, clothing, and agro-processing, but also in the critical services sectors like business support services. But this also requires complementary policies that target women, especially in education, including tertiary training and health, as well as reproductive health. To date, the record of the SDG indicators in these policy areas is patchy. So what messages do you wish to send to African policymakers on these issues as we celebrate and commemorate Africa Industrialization Week?
Yeah, now the micro is on. Thank you very much, Dr. David. Thank you for having me. Yes, the issue of women, it's an important one. Women constitute 50% of African population. They also make up 58% of Africa self-employed. So basically 58% are unemployed. Majority of women or enterprises which are micro and small and also operate in an informal sector. So of course, the CFTA is an enabler, but it cannot do everything. If we are serious about our development, we cannot operate at half of our capacity. So we need to include the women all over. We need to empower them. Therefore, what policymakers needs to do, they need to be deliberate and intentional with regard to complementary policies in higher education. Of course, higher education with emphasis to, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but higher education overall, like the high sectors such as finance, IT, and so forth, and also health, including reproductive health. As like the higher education, which is the tertiary education, and health and reproductive health account for a large part of the women gender gap earning during a woman reproductive years. So it's very important to address these issues. Now, when you look at the sexual and reproductive health education, it's considered taboo in certain society, and therefore resulted on very limited parent-child discussion. Yet it is crucial for general health and well-being, and also it enables the young woman to make choices and decisions about her life or their life. Basically, it reduces unwanted pregnancies, the risk of contracting STIs, sexually transmitted infections, improve the chances of girl continuing school, which is kind of important, and expand their life option, among others. The issue also should be, in my view, this issue of sexual and reproductive health, but I would say like complete sexual and reproductive health should be included in our high school curriculum and must be intensified in informal social and local media platform, because this is an important issue that needs to be advocated, needs to be promoted, and therefore once we're aware of our health and the choices, we can make appropriate choices that can help the women to do the right thing. And I think this is important when we talk about wage gap. It's really important to address these issues so that we can reduce it. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I was unmuted indeed. Thank you very much, Madam Asil, for this response. Actually, I see a connection between what you're saying and what Professor Gunkola said. Professor Gunkola emphasized the public goods aspect of supporting the industrial development process. And your message to policymakers is also to emphasize the public goods aspect of ensuring that women and girls can have are put in a position to be able to make choices that can contribute to reducing the wage gap. You emphasized the importance of education, you emphasized the importance of STEM, as well as tertiary education, as well as, of course, issues around sexual and reproductive health. So both of you seem to be pointing to policymakers to say that, yes, we need to develop, we need the AfCFTA. I think, Madam Asil, you said the AfCFTA is only an enabler. I think both you and Professor Gunkola agree on that, but that much more needs to be done. So thank you for these insights. Let me now turn to Dr. Stephen Karinge. And Dr. Karingi, you are currently in Niger to attend the African Union Summit on Industrialization and Diversification. What are the main themes that have emerged for discussion at the summit?
Thank you very much, David, and good evening. And let me acknowledge my fellow panelists, whom I know very well. Yes, I'm in Niamey. Our leaders will be convening here on Friday. The reason why they'll be coming here is basically to focus on their renewed commitment to the issue of industrialization of the continent. But since Sunday, we've been having a very big platform which the African Union has put together for us to talk about industrialization in Africa. And you asked me what are some of the emerging themes that, or the issues that have been discussed. Actually, we've discussed quite a number of things. We have very many side events, very many ministerial panels. But let me first list some of them before I delve a little bit into some of them. So we've talked about the AfCFTA and industrialization. I think both Professor Olawale and Ms. Asil have talked about that. The AfCFTA. We've talked also at length within during this week, the question of regional value chains and special economic zones, the first point that Professor Olawale highlighted. We've talked about the question of standards and quality policy, because obviously it's a critical issue when it comes to industrialization. We've talked about the issue of financing industrialization, because as you said, the Africa Industrialisation Week has been there for a long time. We do have a continental frameworks, such as the Accelerated Industrial Development in Africa, which has been there for a long time. And so the question is why is it that we've not been able to make any change when it comes to looking at the manufactured value added from Africa in totality, or even we see decline of manufactured value added in many African countries. We talked about decarbonization, industrialization through a sustainable green path, and of course we've talked about women and youth. So if I were to come back to the issue of the AfCFTA and industrialization, I think there is a consensus that one of the main reasons why we have the AfCFTA, or why the AfCFTA was conceived, was basically to allow, to foster industrialization and transformation of the continent. And so the question is, how do we make it do that? So first of all, we have, of course, to meet our commitments in terms of tariff reduction, in terms of removing non-tariff barriers. But more importantly, we have to address the question of how do you ensure that you create regional value chains within the continent? Because it is one thing having the AfCFTA for one country to produce alone. But I think you go far in terms of competitivity if you exploit the comparative advantages in the different African economies. So the question of regional value chains have actually been very critical. And of course, with this, there is of course the question of how do you have regional value chains that allow you to get intermediate inputs from other African countries, considering that today, a lot of the raw materials that are being used in most of the global value chains, a lot of those raw materials normally come from the continent. So there is the question of how do we create, if you may, efficient regional value chains, so that at least you can have many, the African people also benefiting, especially from the rich natural resources that they have. Of course, special economic zones are seen as an instrument or as a tool that can allow that to happen. And especially if you have special economic zones that are clusters that are cross-border, cross-border around more than one economy. Then on the issue of standards and quality, the African consumer is as demanding as any other consumer outside Africa. Mm-hmm. And so it is important that for the African consumers to be able to demand and buy what is produced under the industrialization agenda of the African continent, that whatever it is that they are sold in the market meets their standards. And so there has been a lot of conversation of how do we assure that we have African standards. And of course, what this means is that we need to have a quality policy, an African quality policy. And I think there is consensus that you need that. Because I know you come for a second round, there's a question of financing industrialization. Obviously, you need enough resources for you to be able to address, first of all, the skills gap. You need resources to be able to train the people that you need for industrialization, including the fourth industrial revolution kind of skills. You need, of course, financing to address the energy gap that, of course, makes most of the industries in Africa uncompetitive. Fortunately, the AfCFTA is giving us an opportunity to even start trading on services, including services related to utility. And so you can actually have a manufacturing plant in Kenya or in Sudan that is relying on cheaper power that is exported from Ethiopia. And then, of course, the infrastructure that you need by and large for building industrial capacity. Lastly, because Commissioner Asid has talked about women and youth, let me talk about the issue of decarbonization. I think there is the consensus that industrialization in Africa has to contend with the reality that even though Africa has not contributed much to the situation we have today of climate change and the carbon emissions, Africa does actually have the opportunity also to contribute, just like any member of the international community, towards the attainment of the 1.5 degrees centigrade. And so what are some of the policy tools, what are some of the things that we need to do so that we can industrialize without necessarily failing to use the renewable, the gas that we have in the continent, but at the same time transiting to the renewable energy, or at least using the carbon credit market that is being negotiated to at least to be able to offset whatever carbon emissions that our industrialization process may have. So there are all these things that have actually been debated, and it's a great platform. It's good to be in this industrialization week because there are a lot of ideas that are being put on the table. So I hope maybe I've been able to tease out some of the things that we have discussed, and maybe in a second round I could say more. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Dr. Karinge. I think it's a comprehensive agenda that is being looked at, and it's also an agenda that's very current because you're really delving into the critical issues for industrialization on the continent, from the question of regional value chains, use of intermediate inputs in the productive process. I quite like your point about Africans demanding consumers and appreciate standards and quality. Of course, that's key. The question you also raised of financing industrialization, issues around decarbonization, the thorny question also of ensuring that we follow greener strategies, despite not being responsible for the emissions and the issues around that. No question about that. I also quite liked the point you picked on as regards services under the AfCFTA. So perhaps this is something we could come back to, that as the services market is being liberalized, including in the energy sector, that too is a driver of for the economic integration on the continent. So thank you for giving us, as it were, what is coming in a very hot way from the discussions in Niamey, and I'm sure that the audience would appreciate that. Let me turn again to Professor Ogunkola and to come back to this issue of greener pathways for industrialization. Because as you know, the structural change that countries in East Asia and other early industrializers experienced used fossil fuels and was emission intensive. But as Dr. Karingi has been saying, greener strategies that utilize clean energy and then I would add also internationally tradable services, which are not as pollution intensive, are possible today. So what are your thoughts on these alternative pathways for industrial development with greener outcomes?
Okay, thank you, David. Interestingly, I think the discussion has started with Dr. Stephen Karingi already, with what he did and what he presented. What I want to do is to look at this from two perspectives. You can call it a kind of a SWOT analysis. SWOT in the sense that you are not the one that created the problem, but you have to bear the brunt. Because let's face it, we are more, as Africans, vulnerable to the impact of climate change than any other continent. Let me try to explain this. The issue of drought, floods, the changing farming season that are no longer predictable. Either you have too much rain or not adequate rain or intermittent rain. If you put this one at the background of the type of agricultural practice we have in Africa, then you know that we may be heading for disaster. If droughts or is it a flood that will occur and make agricultural practice impossible. So that's why I'm saying that, yes, we may be complaining about it. Unfortunately, we are not the one that created the problem. But the question is, do we continue this way? No. That's why your question is very important. From the political economy of the issue, to some of us, I will also explain this, it is like removing the ladder. There is a large debate on this. And removing the ladder of economic development, there is nothing, I can't say it is wrong. And the way I'm going to look at it is who set the standards? How high should the standard be? Again, we are all aware of the debate about saving 1 in a billion in terms of standard. People just put in the standard, and we know that some of the standards are actually used as trade barriers. So when we talk about the issue of climate change, the issue of mitigation and adaptation, thank God again, Dr. Karingi raised the issue of financing.
Mhm.
This will also increase the amount of money that we need to be able to finance industrialization, because some of these things will cost a lot of money to even address. But for my own point of view, there is also a kind of trade-off between transformation, structural transformation, especially from agriculture to industry, and the issue of addressing climate change shocks. If we are able to imbibe modern way of doing agriculture, for example, if we practice irrigated farming, then we'll be able to reduce some of the effect or ameliorate some of the effect of climate change. But we also need to train our people how to move towards this. If we use machinery and equipment rather than cutlass and hoes, again, it's likely to address some of these issues and so on. So depending on rain-fed agriculture, it's not the best, but this is what we have right now. But while we move forward, we cannot neglect the issue of climate change, and we can take them together. At least we can use one stone to kill two birds. So it is important, like, again, the issue of standards. I'm saying this because we produce some of these things, we cannot trade them. And somebody will say it's because of the standard. The standard is being set by a group of people. And I think this is a time for African leaders, technocrats, to also participate in setting the standards. If we can do this, then we'll be sure, not necessarily having African standard. If we can integrate whatever we call the African standard into international standard, that will give us a lot of leverage in terms of what we can produce and trade in the international arena. So to me, it's we pollute less, but we are paying the cost. But in order to reverse this, we need to abide by international rules, but the international rules should be fair enough. The issue of, I don't know whether they discussed the issue of transfer, because if you pollute my environment, and now that I want the environment back, who is to pay for it? I think there should be an international debate on this in terms of financing, both adaptation and mitigation measures. Let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much for that, Prof. I think you've touched on this important issue of Africa being at the receiving end, whether we like it or not, of the climate shocks as seen in these extreme weather events. Also, I think you raise a very important point that which Stephen Karingi also has touched on when he talked about comparative advantage and intermediate inputs and what's the sort of trajectory for industrial development. When you're saying that there's that connection between agriculture and industry, and sustainable agricultural practices are going to be important going forward. But then at the same time, also, I think you have internationalized this. We're just, of course, coming from the COP27. For those of us, those who have been following the COP27, that these issues that you raise about financing, African inputs in standard setting, in global rulemaking, and so on, that, of course, all these contentious issues, but issues that African negotiators at the COP were very strong on. So thank you for these insights as well. And I'm sure that we'll come back to these same issues as the discussion continues. Now, let me turn to Madam Asil. Madam Asil, as you know, there's been an initiative to get trade started under the AfCFTA through the guided, this is the guided trade initiative, which will allow commercially meaningful trading to test the operational, institutional, legal, and trade policy environment under the AfCFTA. And it's also an important initiative in terms of sending a positive message to African economic operators that the AfCFTA is viable and ready for business. And as you also know, this initiative, we've seen the first export of goods from Kenya to Ghana on September the 30th, which was officially the start of trading under the AfCFTA. What do you think are the possibilities and challenges of the AfCFTA guided trade initiative?
Thank you very much. I will, if you allow me, Dr. David, I wanted to say something before I come to that question. I read a report when we talk about disparities. I read the report, I think it's a new report, it's a joint report from ILO and also the WHO. And it talks about women in the healthcare and health and care sector face a larger pay gap than other economic sector. And it talks about a 24% less than the men peer. So this is something that actually I omitted to say. And actually women account for 67% of the healthcare worker worldwide. Now we just have COVID and, we're complaining about doctors in our continent. We have other issues as Ebola and so forth. I thought that was really shocking in a way that to see that the healthcare worker is 67% are women, and actually, they earn 24% less. And my view in that, and especially, I'm also in Niamey with Dr. Stephen Kerengi. I think everybody is talking about women empowerment and what do we need to do and how we can implement CFTA. I really do think that we need to have national strategies to implement the CFTA, but to make sure that it's a gender responsive. And in order for us to say that it's gender responsive, I think that we need to do the research to understand what are the discrepancies and how we're going to address them properly. So I think that if we need to really tackle this issue very seriously, we have to understand it. I just thought that this is something that important that I should really mention.
Absolutely, Madam Asil. I think a very important insight, on this issue that you're raising. I didn't mean to interrupt, but just to underline that, yes, indeed, this question of wage disparity, the important role of women in the services, you highlight the health sector, very important, of course, just to underline the point that you're making.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, this initiative, I heard about the initiative today, actually. Yes, I think you have said it. It's commercially meaningful trading. It tests the operational, but what are the possibilities and challenges? I think that the first thing is really to understand our countries. So it's the goal is to have a mismatch, matchmaking businesses. So to understand what country A has and what country B have, what do we the matchmaking businesses and the product for export and import between these two interested countries. So therefore they can start basically more on a bilateral way, but in coordination with the national continental free trade area. I think this is something good. It's something that actually the CFTA is being proactive, is being concrete on pushing countries to go and use the CFTA, Continental Free Trade Area, on a more practical way. And I think that we will see more and more that type of initiative to come. But I think that we also need to do a lot of research. We need to invite countries. We need to make them realize that let's go ahead. And I think this is beneficial for Africa. And I think that it will avoid that perception that it's just a framework. Everybody talk about CFTA. Are we really using that platform, the CFTA? So I think this is something good. And when you talk about this type of initiative, I think you talk about collaboration, because we have the CFTA as a framework. You have the public sector, which is kind of there. And of course, we always have innovation and research, because we need these three parties to be together. Now, the challenges, I think that, when you have it, because when it comes as a proposition, for example, if it comes as a proposition from the Secretariat, you have to be able to convince, the countries to go for it. But if it comes from one country, it also to go to the other one. So the Secretariat will be a facilitator in that, making sure that they have the research necessary. They can show the profit or the gain of doing business under the initiative. So I think this is something good. This is something practical. And I think we will have more and more. That's something actually is very interesting. When I was actually a Commissioner of Trade at that time, I thought about something similar, because at that time we did not have the Continental Free Trade Area yet. I mean, like not the Secretariat, and we don't have a dispute settlement. So I thought about something. Why not? I mean, what forbid the Commission to say, well, we have Dangote and he has issues in Kenya. Why don't we make sure that we facilitate as a Commission, that business between, Dangote and Kenya, and then show that is beneficial to them. So for me, actually, this type of initiative is very welcome, because it's making you to be proactive. It's real and it's concrete, because, instead of saying, well, we have, CFTA, nobody is using it, nobody is training. I mean, like, using it on a concrete way. So I think that I like it. It's for me, it's positive, it's aggressive. And I think that's the way we should go. Starting something is never easy, but I think it's meaningful, as you said. So for me, there is a really positive message on that. Positive message to the African operator, positive message to women, because now we're talking about women and CFTA. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Madam Asil. Proactive, concrete, practical, and also your insights that as Commissioner you supported matchmaking, getting things going, which is always the hardest part to actually get a new initiative underway is always very difficult. And here, let me just mention the historical precedent in the what we now know as the European Union, that started among 6 countries to coordinate their policies on iron, steel, and coal. Coal, of course, which today we know is highly polluting and so on. But basically, that was how what has emerged as this mega market in Europe. That's how it started, from very small beginnings. So I guess, the parallel could be drawn that, yes, whilst technical issues are being settled, and a lot of women are waiting, as you have rightly pointed out, Madam Asil, a lot of women traders are waiting that, a practical, proactive and concrete initiative would be very helpful. So thank you for these insights as well. Let me turn to Dr. Karinge. And Dr. Karinge, the question I'd like to come to is concerns non-tariff barriers. We know that a number of studies by the Economic Commission for Africa, by the World Bank and others have shown that the biggest payoff from the AfCFTA would in fact be in the disciplining of non-tariff barriers. So what are your views on this? And how can stakeholders be empowered to be part of the solution in disciplining non-tariff barriers?
No, thank you again, David. Actually, that's true. The work that we have done at the Commission, whereby we simulate the removal of tariffs as we know the modalities, because we know they're supposed to reduce up to 97% of the tariff lines, and we know what the tariff rates are. So when we do a simulation where you reduce all those tariffs within one market, and then we do another scenario whereby we reduce the same tariffs, and then we just address about 50% of the NTBs that we can at least be able to quantify, methodically in terms of modeling. The benefits that you get in the second simulation are actually more than double the benefits that you get from the first simulation of just dealing with tariffs alone. Because in fact, the average tariff now in the continent is anywhere in the range of 6.1%. But if you do what we call the ad valorem equivalent of NTBs, the average is normally multiples of the 6%. So that's why when you do a simulation whereby you open up the market that way, you see significant benefits. So what is it that needs to be done? I think the monitoring mechanism that has been used in the East African community and in the common market for Eastern Africa, or the tripartite FTA for that matter, because of SADC also, I think that has actually been able to demonstrate that it is possible to have a live reporting of the NTBs that operators experience as they trade, and then have a mechanism whereby the governments are held to account to remove those to deal with those non-tariff barriers that are reported. So I basically wanted to say that the monitoring of the NTBs, and especially the live monitoring now that we are operating in a digital era, it's actually important, and I think we should continue learn the lessons from where it has been used. But what are these NTBs actually? Many of these NTBs sometimes they have to do with the countries not dealing with implementing the trade facilitation agreement, some of their commitments under the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO. Now, the good thing is that under the AfCFTA, the annex that deals with the trade facilitation agreement, it matches almost article for article, of course, not in the same numbering, but in terms of principles and in terms of scope to what we have in the WTO. And so if countries can actually implement the trade facilitation agreement, their commitments under the WTO, that would help address some of the NTBs that arise because of the transport and transit and the border crossing issues that emerge as NTBs. Now, but because not every African country is a member of the WTO, I think an African mechanism, implementing the annex of the trade facilitation agreement under the AfCFTA for the state parties would actually be very useful. The other issue that emerges as NTBs actually relates to different standards. I had talked about the issues of standards, but you have a situation whereby somebody says that, okay, if you're going to sell milk that is processed in Uganda to Tanzania, and you want to sell it into the Kenyan market, we do not want to have it in packages of 500 milliliters. We want to have it in 400 milliliters. So you have a situation whereby lack of harmonization of standards, or even the mutual recognition of standards, allows the customs officials, or even the customs officials to say that you cannot actually be able to bring this product into this market. Now, one of the things that we have done as ECA to talk about the stakeholders is that as part of our support to the implementation of the AfCFTA, we've come up with a tool that we call the AfCFTA Country Business Index. And essentially, the AfCFTA Country Business Index, which of course, David, the origin of this starts with you. I remember you presenting it in Kigali in 2018 on the day that the AfCFTA was signed. So there are 3 dimensions in the AfCFTA Country Business Index. And one of the dimensions, actually, we asked the private sector to tell us what is happening when it comes to the issues of non-tariff barriers as they try to take advantage of the AfCFTA. So having tools that have methodologies that are accepted by the stakeholders, that have been tested and led by governments in their testing or piloting within African countries, and then using the information from those tools, or at least the evidence gathered from those tools, to be able to hold to account the governments that have made commitments under the AfCFTA. I think that is a good way of engaging the stakeholders, because I think if a private sector in a particular state party says that we are facing this problem as we try to take advantage of the one market, and there is evidence that they can actually be able to prove, to show. So it allows governments at least to be able to engage the private sector and the stakeholders. But of course, at the end of the day, the private sector has different components. You have the big private sectors, the medium-sized and the small medium-sized enterprises. You have the informal traders. You also have those informal traders who face special type of NTBs because first of all, even being able to get their payments is a problem, because lack of not being able to move with your currency to the other side of the border, even when our border is meant to be open. These are non-tariff barriers that actually have an impact on trade. So I think engaging stakeholders in an evidence-based way, being able to have committees or intergovernmental committees that look at the evidence and sort of push governments to meet their commitments. I think this is the way to go. Of course, we have toyed with the idea of what if you have sanctions, but it is not something that we've been able to get traction, whereby we say if a government does not address an NTB that is rampant within its jurisdiction, that this is what you're going to do to it. That has not been an area that we've been able to make very progress, but maybe it's an area we can think about, but we need to have the data to be able to do it.
Yeah. Now, thank you very much for this comprehensive response. Firstly, unpacking for us the importance of simulation results from the research. It was Madam Asilo also emphasized the importance of these evidence-based approaches through research. So unpacking the simulation results, showing how important NTBs are. Your efforts to distinguish between different types of NTBs, the transit and cross-border issues as opposed to standards or as opposed to payments, all different types affecting different categories of cross-border economic operators and so on. Also, I think a very important point that there is experience on the continent, as you point out, from Eastern Southern Africa in particular, in dealing with these issues. And under the AfCFTA, there will now need to be an effort to build upon that, and including, as you also said, empowering the private sector to be able to identify and be part of finding the solutions to NTBs. What this tells me, and what I'd like our audience to take from this, is that a lot of thought and planning has gone into supporting or creating the supporting environment for the AfCFTA. And I think that for those who are not been following these issues very closely, I think this should yield some important insights into if you like, the AfCFTA ecosystem as it is being developed. So thank you very much for that. Now, for the final question before I turn it open to our participants, I'd like to put this question to the three panelists, each of our three panelists. This is a question on financing, which we have already talked about. And essentially, what I'd like you to consider is that we know that sustained industrialization, leveraging the large market access granted by the AfCFTA will not only be possible, will only be possible if there is financing to deal with these many gaps, that whether it's in energy or it's relating to investment and so on. So given the financing needs that we are also very much aware of, and just to put some figures on this, the African Development Bank estimates that the continent's infrastructure financing needs it will be as much as 170 billion a year, with an estimated gap of about 100 billion a year. So that's quite a large gap. Do you think reducing this infrastructure financing gap is a prerequisite in determining the potential of the AfCFTA to foster industrialization? Or do you think implementation of the AfCFTA can help speed up the reduction in this infrastructure financing gap? In any order, but I think we should perhaps go ladies first, as the saying goes. So first to Madam Asil.
Well, thank you very much. In my view, I think both. I think that CFTA can, because we need the CFTA, we need integration in order for us to talk about financing infrastructure, because it requires big money. And also, the infrastructure don't have borders. I mean, when you have a road from N'Djamena to Douala, I mean, it crossed Chad and going to Cameroon, for example. So we need the CFTA as a framework to have to attract financement for infrastructure. On the other side, our product have to be competitive, and in order for us to be competitive, we also need infrastructure, because today our product are not competing in a way that the price is high because the cost of production is high. So that's also another issue. And I think that this is why I'm actually a fan of industrial park, because this is something that deals with CFTA now, with production now, but I'm also not for anything that is just kind of, I think we need to train our people correctly, because our best asset is our human resources. We need to train them, and we need to produce a quality product, because we're not at the CFTA just to produce anything, but we need to produce quality products, because the majority of the African market is dominated by middle income class who are requiring superior product. And therefore, we need to ensure that we have good products. So for me, infrastructure, I think the CFTA will help infrastructure. On the other side, I think infrastructure is also needed to do to deliver or to take full benefit of the Continental Free Trade Area. But things can be done. We don't have to wait for infrastructure to have the CFTA. I think that the CFTA should be an enabler for us to move forward. And then the last thing that I wanted to say here, at least in relation to that, I think that we should not forget that profit is always equal price minus cost of production. And when you talk about cost of production, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about energy, we talk about all the stuff. And in order for us to compete, And to have good market, good prices, and so forth, we need to have good infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Madam Asil. Yes, indeed. Profit is a function of the cost that goes into production. And I think you're quite right in highlighting that the AfCFTA will help to drive down these costs, but at the same time also the AfCFTA needs to, will help to attract financing for infrastructure and these related issues. Next, I'll turn to Professor Ogunkola for his thoughts on this subject.
Thank you very much. I think Madam has started, and I agree with her, just to add one or two things. One, government in Africa, we need to reorder priorities. Because I believe some government can do more when it comes to investment in infrastructure. But we are not talking about a small amount of money, no. That's why I think, yes, AFDB is trying its best. We also need to see multilateral organization. World Bank should also be part of this. I know China will be willing, but the question is whether we are ready for conditions from China, because it's not going to be build, operate, and transfer. But more importantly, there is need to look inward, not necessarily outside. There is a possibility of private-public partnership in terms of financing some of this infrastructure. But just as Madam said, it's interesting to note that this can go pari passu. We don't need to waste until all these things are in place. But we can manage the process in such a way that we make progress on both fronts and possibly reduce cost of doing business by providing some of this basic infrastructure. And I think Stephen will take up the issue of what has been going on at continental level. There are master plans and there are commitments that I think if only governments actually do their bit, they can reduce this to manageable level for those who are going to help from outside the country, or the continent rather.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, for these thoughts, and which you have, in a sense, passed the baton on to Stephen Karinde to follow up on that. So over to you, Stephen.
No, thank you. But I think what you asked earlier, what should come first, or what should be, yeah, I mean, is it what kind of function is it? Is it you have AfCFTA first, or investment first for you to get the results? And I think Commissioner Asil actually answered that question. But I was going to say that if you talk to many people, you've heard about the Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa, PIDA, and now we are in PIDA 2.0. One of the things that, if you go to those meetings, one of the things that you hear is that money is not the problem. That actually that $170 billion can actually be mobilized. In fact, you talk to major banks, they say they can actually be able to provide that money, including banks in Africa. Now, but what they say is that first of all, they cannot find bankable projects. So everybody says that we need, first of all, to be able to enhance the capacity to be able to come up with good projects. And when you have a good project that is bankable, you get the money. But I just wanted to make that point because I think it's for our listeners to know that there is that school, of thought. But I think the financing gap that we have in the continent today, and one way to fix it is actually to address the question of the private sector. The reason why the economies in the West or now the emerging economies in Latin America and in Asia are able to do what they're able to do to finance their development, is because they have a robust private sector that government can be able to tax and be able to meet to be able to have budgets that can, to finance budgets that can be able to do the kind of infrastructure that we need. So one of the things that we need to do is to address the question, why is it our private sector is not deep enough? And if you look at it clearly, it's because also the financing of the private sector is only done through the commercial banks. You do not have deep capital markets that would allow the private sector to be able to mobilize capital so that they can at least be able to expand. So I think one of the things that we need to do to deal with this question of financing is at least to address the cause of the poor financing of the African private sector, because it's only when we have a private sector that is robust that we can be able to maximize on the domestic resource mobilization. The other point I wanted to mention is on the question of innovative finance. I think I hinted this in my first reaction. So we have the huge Congo forest. You have the forests that you have in Gabon, in Central Africa. And if there's going to be a carbon market that is going to be, there's going to be a carbon price that is going to be set under the Article 6 of under the COP negotiations moving forward, there is a lot of money that Africa can make out of this carbon market. And I think that becomes one of the ways that Africa will be able to address the question of development finance, because at least we have the resources, yet whether you are going to trade carbon because you have a huge carbon sink, or because there are others who want to take advantage of the carbon, the oxygen that is breathed from the Congo forest, and they want to use that to offset whatever it is they are doing, and there is a price to that. I think kind of innovative financing that is related to renewable, to issues of dealing with climate change is also going to be a good source of resources to finance our development, including the infrastructure. And last thing is those companies that have come and established their businesses in Africa, especially the FDI from outside who have come and established themselves in Africa, they want to stay. But those who have not come, they don't want to come because of what they read and what they hear. I think the question of addressing the risk perceptions about the continent, I think that is also going to help in the question of financing our development. And I think there is a governance dimension and the freedoms that people have that I think we also have to deal with if we want to really deal with the question of financing our development. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Kiringi, giving us this broad perspective on this question of financing, and also to the other two panelists, Madam Asil and Prof. Ogunkola, for your thoughts on the same issue. Now, let me turn to the questions. I know that the remaining time is not that much, and I do want to bring in as many of the questions as possible. Firstly, we have Andrew Shepard, who is asking all the panelists, I guess this is to all of you, how can Africa's industrialization be inclusive, bringing into the formal labor force relatively uneducated, poor or marginal sections of the population, including women, or will it continue to rely on the informal economy? I'll read a few more questions, and please just note some of them and see how you would want to address them. Another question is from Joe Smith, who is based in Newcastle. He's an LSE student, and he's asking, again, directed to the panelists, what do you think would be the one change of policy which would have the biggest impact? Then I have Rania, who is an economist at the International Growth Center. This one is for Prof. Ogunkola, and she's asking, why are SEZs not linked up with domestic economies currently? How would you recommend governments should encourage these links, i.e. you mentioned investment? Where do you see that investment being targeted? She goes on with several other questions related to this, but I'll move on to someone else. Yes, let me take this one from James Ochieng, who is in Kenya, and this is to Dr. Keringe. How can African countries take advantage of cross-border production sharing to promote industrialization and the AfCFTA? Then we have Richard Newfarmer, who is an IGC country director for Rwanda and Uganda, and this is to the panel. He says the panel has highlighted several policy, some of which imply trade-offs. For example, developing the region's oil reserves in, say, Uganda or South Sudan versus reducing the carbon content of the exports. What questions for research that most urgently need answers to inform policy decisions about trade-offs affecting industrial strategies? Then finally, we have Molonga Hazemba from Zambia, and she's asking, should we not focus on creating multi-facility and special economic zones that have industries capable of supplying to each other within the zone? This seems like a better way to cut costs, transport access to materials, and ensures that majority goods that leave the zones are value-added finished goods. There are several more questions, but I think I'll stop here because this is quite a handful already. And again, I'll go to Madam Asil first. Madam Asil.
Well, thank you very much. I did not note some of the questions that were directed to Prof. and, Dr. Stephen Kerengi, but some of them, I think one of them is a change of policy that would have the biggest impact, for example. For me, I always advocated that the industrialization is not a job of a minister in a country or is not a job of a commissioner of trade. I think industrialization requires everybody from a governmental level. And actually, I was in a panel this morning, and I was saying that, in my view, industrialization should be put at, for example, a prime minister, level. And therefore, that prime minister will have 3 vice presidents. One will be the industrialization minister. The second one will be the research and development minister, or how do you call it, higher education minister. And the other one is actually the private sector. So we really need, these 3 people, and of course, other people from the government, because we have to make sure that we don't get into any agreement that hinder our industrialization. So this is very important, because now we're talking about countries needs to put X amount of money to, to the industry department and so forth. I think we used it for so long and it didn't happen. So I think that it should be done in a coordinated fashion. I think it's very important in a coordinated fashion. And that's why I thought that it's a prime minister office. Now, there is also something that is very important. I think I said it before. When you look at our consumer, like the African micro consumer, there are middle-sized people. And the middle-sized that they demand products that of quality and also competitive. I think we need to train our youth. Of course, when you talk youth, you talk also about women. Training is crucial. One thing that also we need to make sure that the rule of origin are simple and flexible, so that, they can understand it, it can allow the informal trade to go easily. So it's very important. It's important to understand the market perspective overall, because when you talk about value chain, today, some of the countries have local value chain. How do you move from local value chain to sub-region and to regional and, even to global? So I think that we have that, and it's very important. So, now, how can it be inclusive? I think also, you know, I took an example. For example, I was fascinated to hear that in Gabon, just to take the wood from, you know, like other part of Gabon to bring it to Libreville, to the port, it costs 5 times more than bringing actually a finished good from Asia. So we need to do something. And I think that one of the solutions could be that the first transformation could be done at, you know, like where, you know, the wood can be found, or where, you know, we can produce, so that actually people from the rural even area, or where the production is, can even stay. And then we have revenue, and then we can move the goods, which is kind of transform at first, you know, like to, you know, other capital, for example, to the capital for the second and third transformation. I think that's good. One thing that I want to say is actually, I found it fascinating. I don't know if there is a specific question about it or not, but I found that we trained some women. And what we train them at the CEMAC, you know, we train them about, you know, like the market and how you have value chain, and you know, how we can, so actually all the policies, all the texts that we have at the CEMAC, we train them in packaging, and of course they ask about the issue of finance, how we're going to do, we can deal with that. And one thing is they ask about it is trade facilitation. They're claiming that, you know, when they take goods from country A to country B, you know, it's so expensive when it gets there. It just, you know, it's not worth it. So what we have done is actually we did a survey. I don't know if it's an investigation. And we found that actually, you know, you will find people from the police, from the custom, from the health sector, from forestry, you know, like so many people. And then when we went and we met with 163 Director General to ask them what are these people doing and why we're doing all this stuff. And then they're saying, well, they're there. And now I think that after minister, we spoke to multi-sectoral ministers. I mean, as I said, forest, custom, I mean, finance, health, and so forth. And today, for example, it was reduced from N'Djamena, which is Chad, to Douala, for example. And then they said, okay, we can have only, you know, 6 checkpoints. And therefore, they will know exactly where the checkpoints are. And now the minister have them to go back. The last thing that I will say, I don't know if this is a question or not. I think that whenever that you talk about changes, whenever you talk about development, you're going to have resistance. And it's important that people at the government level, African level, speak with one voice, regardless of the difficulties that we're going to have with the infrastructure and so forth. We don't have any choice for industrialization. We must speak as one man. We must industrialize. We must form our people, our women, and then we must do it. It must be done. It cannot wait anymore. And I think that literature, we have enough literature to prove that we have problems, to prove that we have financing issues. And the last thing that I want to pose to the table here, I don't know if some of you have answered. What is the role of the local bank, the central bank, in development in Africa, in industrialization? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Asil. Over to you, Stephen. And on that last point that Madam Asil made about the role of the banks, there's actually a question which I would just quickly read. Please include that in your response. And that is, how important is the role that multilateral development banks or development finance institutions have in mobilizing additional financial capital? Do you feel they're doing enough in the region? And what more would you like to see from them? This is from Michael Button. So over to you, Stephen.
No, thank you. So there were specific questions. So on the question of inclusive industrialization, let me just give you one thing. So of course we have done, again, simulations whereby we see which sectors are going to benefit the most from the AfCFTA. So we know that industry, and especially including manufacturing like agro-processing, pharmaceuticals, they are going to grow the most out of the intra-African trade because of the AfCFTA. Now, if you get those results now and you superimpose them to the household survey data, because countries do household survey, what we have found out is that you are a rural woman who is not well educated, you're operating in the informal sector, you do not benefit as much from the AfCFTA than another woman who is operating in the formal sector or even in the informal sector, but is in the urban sector and it is educated. So what this means is that our inclusive agenda of the industrialization, considering that it's agro-processing and pharmaceuticals that are going to be some of the sectors that are going to grow, we have to be quite intentional in the way we structure our protocol on women and trade that is going to be part of the AfCFTA. On the question of the cross-border production, I think we did actually handle it previously earlier in our intervention. I think it makes a lot of sense that now that we have rules of origin, there is going to be, we do actually have rules of origin that operate within this one market. It becomes easier for cross-border production, or at least having value chains that trade with each other with accumulation that allows companies to be able to trade on intermediate inputs and even reverse of the value added in one country going back to where the original intermediate input came. Now, on the role of the multilateral development bank, I think this is a very good question. I think multilateral development banks have actually been very active within the continent. They help in terms of financing infrastructure, but maybe the fact that you have countries that are not part of the low incomes, countries that of course do not have the windows that are concessional. So they cannot be able just to pile up on their debt or the loans that they get from these NDBs. So the question is it possible to be also creative in the windows that these multilateral development banks that they have that are specific, especially those that are actually going to help African countries as they transit in there towards also take the path of the net zero? Is it possible also to include the middle income African countries? And by the way, most of the economy of the African economy is in the middle income countries, the South Africas, the Nigerias, the Kenyans. But unfortunately, these countries, they do not have the same kind of windows for getting money from these NDBs the way the low income, the LDCs have. Yet the LDCs in Africa, they constitute a small part of the African economy. So when the middle income countries suffer, the African economy suffers. So I think there is something to think about there. I see the time is going. I was going to answer the question on the questions for research, and I think for me, I go back to the issues of what was discussed in COP27 from COP26. I think we need to start asking ourselves, what does the AfCFTA mean for climate change? What does climate change mean for the AfCFTA? What does the climate change mean for Africa's industrialization? And then we need to start structuring good policies that will allow Africa, first of all, to take opportunities that are presented by the climate change challenge, or at least addressing the climate change challenge, and at the same time also not contributing, also contributing in a way that we also help to resolve the problem. So there are quite a number of research issues to address there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Stephen. And over to you, Olawale Ogunkola. You have almost the last word.
Thank you very much. I think let me just focus on one issue, which I think is directed at me, and the question of how to make special economic zones more relevant to the host economy? It is very simple. I think in the design and planning, we should have it at the back of our mind that whatever we do in SEZ are part of the national development strategy. They are not isolated. I think that's where we miss it. We treat issues in silos, whereas we need a development strategy where all these issues should fit into. So it should be an integrated kind of approach, and there should be policy coherence. Not that the central bank is saying something else, the fiscal policy authority is saying something else. There is need to be deliberate in terms of what you want out of some of these policies that we are talking about. Let me give you an example. The issue of a special economic zone can be more relevant if we have things like local content policy. I hope there is nobody in WTO that will raise an issue about this. But to me, you cannot just be located in Benin and you have a lot of people or a lot of resources, but you are importing your input from China, whereas you can still get it here. You import technicians who are substandard to our own technicians around us. I think there is need for deliberate policy when we are looking at this. But I think what people do, the government normally focus on foreign direct investment. And the question is, and so what? The issue of training and developing capacities of people to be able to use whatever knowledge they gain in working or in their relationship with SEZ outside the zone, to me is very important. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much for that, Olawale Ogunkola. Well, we've come to the end of time and this very fascinating discussion tonight. But by way of wrap up, I'd like to ask each of our panelists just to take a minute to say what is the one policy action that they would like to see as a follow-up to getting the industrial development agenda moving. Just one policy action. Again, Madam Asil, first.
Thank you very much. For me, the desired objective, which is really moving from factor-driven to innovation-driven stage, won't be achieved by chance or by luck, regardless of the continental free trade area. So I think that what we need to do is we need to move forward in a coherent manner so that we can move forward. We have to train our people in order to produce something good. The world, I think, is moving to the fifth industrial revolution, and therefore we have to be conscious of that. So we need to move in a coherent approach to really from factor-driven to innovation economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Madam Asil. From factor to innovation, very important point. Professor Ogunkola.
Yeah, I think policies that we make or optimize the advantages of the various small, medium, and enterprises that we have. We have a lot of them. They are resilient. They are contributing a lot, but I don't think we link them with the mainstream and formal sector. So I'd like to see a policy that when we are designing this, we consider the way they can be integrated and add value to whatever policy we are talking about.
Thank you for that, Professor Ogunkola. You are focusing on SMEs, very important point. Stephen Karinge.
I think you can guess what I'm going to say. Implement the AfCFTA, and you get a very good foundation for industrialization and you realize industrialization. Just implement the AfCFTA.
Very good. Yes, Well, thanks to our panelists for a very fascinating discussion. Madam Fatima Asil, Professor Olawale Ogunkola, Dr. Stephen Karinge, a big thank you to each of you. I think we've had, as I say, a wonderful time together. Let me also just say that we would like your audience just to remind you that there is a brief survey immediately following this event. So please take a minute to fill that out, as your feedback is very important to us. So once again, thanks to all, to the audience, thanks to the audience also for the questions that they have sent in. I'm sorry that I could not read all of them in full, but I think we've got a good flavor of some of your thoughts. And also thanks to the IGC for organizing this event. And we look forward to seeing all of you again. Thank you so very much, and good night to all.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.